Hello everyone, and welcome to the class. I first would like to thank Professor Bauman for covering for me and coming in early on a Monday morning to participate in this class. I know there was a lot of faculty volunteering to come and hear a lecture on New Imperialism, so he won through a lottery selection. I mean, it was a very prestigious job here to come and sit and watch this PowerPoint. I mean, there are probably a dozen or so faculty really just eager to come. But no, thank you, Professor Bauman, and thank you all for coming in today and finishing up our lecture on New Imperialism. And we'll also look at the Western Hemisphere and Australia in the second half. Okay, so we already started this lecture on New Imperialism, and let's go to our fact that we started off with. Talked about how the new imperialism happened in the late 19th, early 20th century, and that almost a quarter of the world was taken over by 6 European nations. And we looked at this map. And so we talked a little bit about new imperialism, and now this second half, I guess, of the lecture is going to talk about the scramble for Africa, and it's also going to talk about Europeans in Asia. So the only thing we've gotten so far were the reasons why Europeans wanted to conquer other territories, in particular new imperialism centers on Africa and Asia. So Garrett, I know it's a little weird to talk to a screen. Do you want to give us some of the reasons why Europeans colonized these countries? That's wrong. You're wrong. All right. And let's see. Roy. I don't know if Garrett covered all of them, but Roy, is there any other ones? Okay. Everybody's probably laughing. At least I think you're laughing. Yeah. All right. You're probably right. You probably have some of these reasons. So we'll talk a little bit about this. I don't need to state definition or who was involved. All right, one reason was competition. Did you talk about competition? Another reason was nationalism. Another reason was humanitarian / religious reasons. And tied into this was white man's burden. And also economics was probably the most important. So that's where we left off. All right, so Europe, it's a pretty small continent. Relative, I guess, to the rest of the world. But yet these small Western countries, think of how small Belgium is, How did tiny Belgium build an empire in Africa? How did the Netherlands, also pretty small, create a massive empire? Well, they had some significant tools that allowed them to conquer these various regions. They had advantage of modern transportation. This ties in with our lecture of the Industrial Revolution. So you've got the steam engine. Without the steam engine, you're not going to have these massive empires. So you're going to get to your empires, and that's going to be the steamboat. So the steamboat dramatically reduces the amount of time that it's going to take to get from Europe to these colonies. Okay, the coasts are going to be the first places that are colonized, and then they're going to work their way to the interior following different rivers. So it's going to be done by water first and by steamboats. All right, once they've been there for a while, they're going to start laying railroads. Okay, and so then that's going to solidify the control of the interior of the colonies once they have railroads in place. So really, without the steam engine, you're not going to have as dramatic, colonization as you would with it. Okay. The other thing is not only did they have great transportation, that they also had vastly superior military means. So they had automatic rifles, and you see this picture here, the Battle of Omdurman. Okay, this is in the Sudan. The British and their allies attacked the Sudanese. They had a colony to the north in Egypt, and they moved south into the Sudan. And during this battle, because they had automatic rifles, and the Sudanese, what did they have? They had muskets. They had bow and arrows. It's not a fair fight. It's not a battle. It's a slaughter. So the British and their allies had 47 deaths. Okay, 47 fatalities. Okay. On the other side, the indigenous population that was resisting the imperialism had over 10,000. Again, this is just kind of somewhat of an estimate. But really thousands and thousands of people died because, again, they're using muskets running into machine guns. So you can see with very few people, right, the British with superior weapons, okay, superior medicine like quinine, which, you know, fights malaria, the superior transportation, they can conquer a vast amount of territory. The last point is actually the Europeans really didn't colonize Africa and Asia. All right, this is kind of strange. Africa and Asia were often colonized by their own people. That doesn't make sense. But they had this tactic of divide and conquer. So when you look at the British, for example, in India, the Indian sepoys, they were not the sepoys, or the people that served in the East India Company military. They weren't British. There was a handful of British officers. They had hundreds of thousands, okay, several hundred thousand, okay, Indians fighting for them to colonize India, okay. So it's pretty amazing, actually, that these native populations, they got a great deal. They got great housing, great uniforms, great food, but they were the ones that were actually fighting and dying often with just a couple European officers to oversee them in conquering this territory. So hopefully it makes a little bit more sense now how the British and other Europeans were able to pull this off. So now we're going to look at our two regions. But first we're going to look at Africa. Now Africa has been trading and, you know, I guess there's been European settlements in Africa since the 1400s. So now we're in the 1800s. That's 400 years later. So what's the difference between the new imperialism and the old imperialism? Is that the early colonization, really, they didn't make any settlements. They remained on the coast. And I'll put up a map in a second to really demonstrate this. So they didn't go to the interior at all. We heard a presentation on Dr. Livingstone. AK did a great presentation. He was the first European in the 19th century to cross Africa. Okay. Now, they didn't go to the interior because they really were there for trade purposes. They didn't want territory. They didn't want land. Okay, and what did they want? This relates to triangle trade. They wanted slaves, okay? So I'm sure you've heard triangle trade in your high school history classes, but just look at this map for a second here. That the British, for example, would send manufactured goods, you could say gin, cloth, guns, down to Africa. They would, on these coastal settlements, they would trade those manufactured goods for slaves, bring those slaves to the New World. There they would work in plantations, and they would grow cotton, they would grow sugar, they'd grow rice, they'd grow tobacco, and then they'd bring those raw materials back to Europe. It was very profitable, and Africa figured big into the system, but it was mainly a trading stop, not a full-fledged colony in which they conquered the interior of Africa. Okay, so that happens from really the 1400s all the way up to 1800. So you can see here, very important map here. On the bottom left is Africa in 1878. The colored regions are the regions controlled by Europeans. So they're green, there's some French colonies, and we can see Algeria is a pretty big one to the north. You can see that the Portuguese had some large one. That's a dark purple, okay? Those were stopping points actually to Asia. There was a big Dutch and later English one in South Africa, and actually a lot of white settlers there. And then the western coast has got these little dots, just different colors. Those were the trading settlements where the slaves would really be picked up. Okay. Now, fast forward to 1914. This is a map of Africa. Okay. Everything except the light green, and there's only two: Ethiopia and Liberia. Only two countries that are independent. The rest of these colored countries are controlled by Europeans. This is the new imperialism in a snapshot. It shows you how Africa went from an independent continent, excuse me, to one that was really controlled completely by Europeans. Okay, North Africa. So let's just look at some of these regions here. You can see that very early on that there was a little settlement in North Africa, Algeria. It's in the north. And it was first attacked in 1830, so it's one of the oldest of these larger colonies. And actually, since it was so close to France, there was a lot of French settlers that moved into Algeria. I think close to about 10% of the population was French at the time of independence. And then they all went back to France after decolonization. So they really just start with this little dot kind of in Algeria. Settlers move in. And from there, they want to rule all of North Africa. So I'll put up this map a little bit later, but this whole green region that you saw is really the French expanding from Algeria out and to control a whole section of North Africa. Now, the British also start in the north. They start in Egypt. The Suez Canal was built in 1869. This is a canal that connects the Red Sea with the Mediterranean, and this drastically reduces the amount of distance that ships have to go from Asia to Europe, and it's a huge trading route. And so this was a very important strategic colony for trading purposes. So a lot of this was built with European investment, British investment, and eventually, because they start defaulting, the British start moving in. They send a military invasion in the early 1880s, and from control of Egypt, they kind of get into this struggle, the scramble between the French and the British for control of more and more territory. They see the French expand, so they have to expand. And so France wanted all of northern Africa. Britain is in their way. Britain wants all of East Africa. French is getting away, and so they're going to expand to kind of beat the other nation. The West Africa, the background, this is where the slaving trading colonies were. So you're going to see those little dots, which are just coastal trading posts in the 15, 16, 1700s. And from there, they're going to expand. So they're going to move to the interior. So there's almost this natural progression. And then also in West Africa, there's some new players that weren't involved in the slave trade that are late to the imperialistic trends. And then they're going to go and try to establish new colonies for their own purposes because they want to be a great nation. Remember that competition. So you have Leopold II of Belgium pictured here. Such a nice guy. Belgians think, they're so nice. In reality, it's quite sad. There's actually a very good book, Leopold's Ghost. That's what it is. I think it's called. I remember reading in graduate school. But it's very easy to read. And the author claims that over 10 million Congolese died under Leopold's rule. And what he really wanted was rubber. Because automobiles had just been invented and rubber was very valuable. And he became fabulously wealthy. He never actually went to the Congo, which is what he ruled, Belgian Congo. But he got awards for being a great humanitarian, But then the truth came out. The only thing that was going to the Congo was guns, basically. And there wasn't any aid going. No aid. It was just a really brutal regime under the British. Under the Belgians. Who would think, the Belgians, they seem so nice. Everybody I've met from Belgium has been so nice. Yet they, we're talking 10 million. That's more than the Holocaust, more than the amount of Jews that died during World War II, just to put that in perspective. But yet nobody really talks about it. Germany also moves into the southern part of West Africa, because they're looking to expand. They're looking to have colonies as well. So now you got all the new players. You've got all these new players, and they're kind of there's this mad rush for colonies, and the Europeans say, hey, we need to meet to talk about Africa. And of course, where do they meet? They meet in Berlin. They don't meet in Africa. They meet in Berlin. And guess who's invited? Is there any Africans invited? No. These are European foreign ministers, prime ministers, European royalty meeting, and they're dictating, okay? Bismarck, okay? The chancellor of Germany, dictating how Africa is going to look like. So the equilibrium is disturbed because you have these new countries rushing in, trying to seize territory in Africa. The Europeans say, hey, we need to lay the ground rules. And the ground rules are basically they're going to have to have an army in place to claim a territory. You can't just stick your flag anywhere. They recognize certain colonies that already existed. For example, Leopold's Congo was recognized at this conference. And so this really formalizes the scramble, okay? So that's the point of the Berlin Conference. Okay. Now, East Africa, the background is this was just a stopping point towards Asia. Portugal had a colony there just to kind of as a jumping off point. And then what happens is other people rush in. The French rush into Madagascar. Okay, the British start moving in, the Germans start moving in, and this is scramble. This is really when it becomes a scramble. There's no economic value to East Africa. There's no resources there. Why are people going after these colonies? Just so somebody else can't have it. Sounds like my toddler. I have a 1 and 4-year-old, and it sounds like how they play. They just want to grab a toy so the other one can't have it. But the sad reality, this is European politics in the late 1800s, scrambling over Africa, grabbing a territory just so that the other people can't have it. I shouldn't say there's no values. There's no resources there like rubber, gold, or diamonds like there are in other areas. So it made no economic sense. This was purely an issue of pride. South Africa was originally a Dutch colony, and there's a lot of Dutch settlers. They call them the Boers, okay? I don't know why. Maybe our resident Dutchman can explain to us why. But they lost it in the 7-Year War, if I remember correctly, and it became a British colony, so the British Cape Colony. And there was tension with these Afrikaners, these Boers, these settlers that were there previously. They had a very aggressive British governor, Cecil Rhodes. I don't know if you heard of the Rhodes Scholars. He financed that. Also, he started a diamond company with not the Rockefellers, the other wealthy family. Rothschilds, the Rothschilds, that's it. And the Bears, I think, diamonds that control, like, the vast majority, 90% of the diamond trade. It's ridiculous. But he knew that there was a lot of wealth, a lot of precious metals, diamonds, gold, and so he initiates a very aggressive series of wars right around the turn of the century, right around 1900. There's a series, 2 wars with the Boers, and they eventually conquer that territory and incorporate it into the British Empire. And so South Africa expands, and it's under British control. The one counterexample, I said I was going to put the map back, but I'm actually realizing now, as I've already recorded about 15 or 20 minutes, that I'm using the wrong PowerPoint. I'm using an outdated one, but I'm not going to redo it. But anyways, is Ethiopia. Remember I told you the Italians not very good at war overall. They usually only acquire territory if they can trick you, like you're fighting somebody else and then they kind of jump in, or they switch sides like they did in World War I and World War II. Well, anyways, they attacked Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian monarch, Menelik, was an amazing ruler, brilliant man. He played the European players off the European powers off of each other. So he was able to get support from the French and the British against the Italians. He modernized his country, and he was able to defeat the Italians. So this is the one case where the Africans were able to resist through diplomatic means and modernization and defeat the Italians. So really only Ethiopia and Liberia, which was an American colony, not American colony, but an American protected state. If anybody knows what Liberia is, it's a colony that was formed by America for former slaves. So they sent slaves from America back to Africa and settled them in Liberia. So only those 2 countries, those are the only 2 countries that survived the era of new imperialism. Okay. So now let's shift gears a little and give you a little rundown about Asia, our other area that was under attack during the new imperialism. Now, Asia was the reason why Europeans left Europe, okay? They bumped into America, but Columbus wasn't interested in America. He didn't know it existed. He wanted to get to the wealth, the riches, the material goods that were in Asia, okay? The Portuguese, they kind of ended up settling first around Africa, but they weren't trying to get to Africa. They're trying to go around Africa to Asia. So early contact is the late 1400s. The Portuguese are the first in India, Calicut, in the 1490s. And they traded for centuries, but really up until the 1800s, most of Asia is still largely independent. It's not been conquered by Europeans. Okay, so now look at a map here. Okay. All right, so the biggest colony, boom, is the one right in the middle, okay? It's the India, basically. but that includes modern-day Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Burma, which is Myanmar, Malaysia, Singapore, all of that area. Okay. Now, if you move slightly to the right, you see French Indochina. That's like Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And then you see our Dutch colony. Those Dutch, oh my gosh. Oh, no, just kidding. Nothing bad really about the Dutch. They controlled what was present-day Indonesia. It's called the Dutch East Indies. If you go up a little bit north from the East Indies, you see the Philippines. It's kind of blue. It almost looks like the same color as the water. I don't know who did that. That's an American colony. Now, the big one that's independent is China, obviously. But China was conquered, but it was really distributed into spheres of influence. So it really was wiped out. It really wasn't truly independent. And you see Russia, which is that mustardy, orangey color. They're coming south, okay, into Mongolia. They're almost threatening Afghanistan. They're threatening Korea and Japan. And you can see Japan, the green-colored country, had conquered Korea. So this is just, I guess, most of Asia is not independent if you really consider that China was really defeated. If you switch the color of China. Of course, the only one that really resisted and resisted well was Japan. We'll get to that. So the English in Asia, we'll talk about Australia at great length in a second. But just acknowledge, actually, why this is a bad slide. English in Asia, and Australia is not in Asia, and Australia is actually in another lecture. So just ignore that for a second here. And I do apologize here because I realize this is not the proper slide again. India was ruled, write this down, by the East India Company. So a corporation that you could buy stock in, okay, was formed in the early 1600s, and they were given a monopoly for trade in Asia. So this East India Company, from really around 1600 all the way to 1858, for about 260 years, ruled. It wasn't the British government. It was a corporation. And this corporation was in India to trade, okay? And they did very well. They traded first textiles, cotton, tea. I mean, part of the reason why the American Revolution happened, the Boston Tea Party, was because of a trade agreement with the East India Company that gave them a privileged status. And they had a massive army. They had a bigger army than the British government. So this corporation had several 100,000 people in its army, and they were sepoys. These are Indians. Now, eventually they revolted, and this is a little bullet point here, the Sepoy Mutiny in 1858. They revolted, and it was crushed by the British brutally. Some of the sepoys remained loyal. Other British armies were on their way. But there was atrocities on both sides. The sepoys slaughtered a lot of British, but yet later when the British kind of regained control of the territory, they slaughtered the mutineers, I guess. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Here's a picture. These are the people that were mutinying, the sepoys, or revolting. In India, they call it the National First War of Independence. They tied them to cannon, and then they would just blow them up. The British said, this is what's going to happen to you if you revolt. Okay, pretty scary stuff. Okay. Now the Russians, we talked about this a little bit when I showed you the map. They move west into Siberia. That's the northern part of Russia. They start moving south. They start moving down to the border of Afghanistan, which is really the border with the British India. They start moving down south, encroaching on the northern part of China. They move south into Korea. So they're expanding west and south, and they're acquiring more and more territory. And it's just a massive country. They end up bumping into Japan because Japan becomes an imperial power. And they bump really around Korea. And so there's a war fought between Japan and Russia in 1905. And it's kind of a funny story because the Russian fleet was in the Baltic Sea. And they had to sail for like, I don't know, several months around Europe, around Africa, all the way through the Indian Ocean. Finally get there, and then they're defeated almost immediately. It's like almost like a waste of time. Like, build up all the excitement, and then they're kind of defeated. And so this was a great humiliation. This is the first time that the Europeans were defeated by an Asian power in the modern period, and it really shows that Russia was quite backwards and on the decline, and Japan was quite advanced and on the ascendancy. China, everybody wanted China. It was the most populous country as it is today. It had huge markets. They wanted Chinese goods. They wanted their tea. They wanted their porcelain. They wanted their silk. They wanted their technology. I guess that maybe not technology at this particular point. But Chinese goods were highly desirable. And their market was highly desirable. But China had closed itself off to the world. And actually, they were only trading through one point, Canton, okay, what is Guangzhou today, or is adjacent to Hong Kong. It's in the same vicinity, okay. They had closed themselves off to the world. The Qing dynasty was just not interested in contacting the Europeans or trading with them. And what ends up happening is that the Chinese really didn't want anything, but they were addicted. A vast section of the Chinese population was addicted to opium. So the British start growing opium in India and start smuggling into China for these valuable goods that they wanted, like tea, which there was highly desirable for the British, who were addicted, I guess, to tea. So, but I'd say the Chinese are getting the raw end of the deal. I mean, opium is much more destructive than tea. So they were smuggling this tea in, smuggling this opium in, even though it was illegal. And so eventually, the Chinese destroyed the opium and threw it in to the water, and the British merchants lost a lot of money. So the British, with a superior navy, destroyed the Chinese in the First Opium War, and they just took their modern vessels with modern cannons, the ports of China, and it was a lopsided battle. And so the Chinese have to surrender, and they get the Treaty of Nanking or Nanjing, and this ends the Opium War, or at least the First Opium War, and they have to open up several other ports. They give Hong Kong at this particular time to the British as a kind of a base, becomes British territory. And now other countries rush in, and now Americans in particular want an open door policy, which means that they wanted access to Chinese markets. So the French, the Russians, the Americans, the Japanese, they're all rushing into China, trading. And so this closed country was pried open through military means. Now Japan, at first they resisted Western encroachment, but also through gunboat diplomacy, the Americans sent a fleet of modern vessels, pried Japan open. But then the Japanese said something which the Chinese did not do. And that is, they said that they wanted to modernize. So both countries realized they're closed, didn't want Western influence, and then they both kind of lost, forced to sign humiliating treaties. China doubles down on tradition. Japan says, no, we're going to Westernize. So they throw all over the shogun, the leader of Japanese feudalism and medieval ways of thinking. They would take the Emperor Meiji, and they restore him to the power, because the emperor was just a figurehead. But he was a very forward and modern thinking emperor. And he initiates reform, okay? They bring in consultants from the United States. They bring in consultants from Germany and from Britain, train them how to fight in the military. They build navies. They fast forward the Industrial Revolution. They send out people to colleges and universities in Europe. They write a constitution. They have universal male suffrage. They adopt Western clothes and Western styles of dressing. Look at this picture. They're using Western military dress and Victorian style dresses. That's not Japanese. And as a result, they're able to actually defeat the Western powers, as I mentioned, the Russians in 2005. So some other native responses, the Chinese. And the Qing dynasty, which was ruling, had just lost the Opium War. And this is actually quite a funny story. The Taiping Revolution started with this young, disgruntled individual, Hong. That's the easy part now, if I can pronounce his last name. Xua Chuang? I think I nailed it. That's it. No, I butchered it. But anyways, he had some dreams. Maybe the opium was involved. I'm not really sure. And then eventually he meets a Western missionary. And he reads the Bible and he says, I know the dreams. I am actually Jesus' younger brother. And I'm called to form a heavenly kingdom here on earth and overthrow the Qing Empire. And so there's this huge civil war. Tens of millions of people die. It was a very brutal civil war in China. Eventually it fails because there's so much infighting among the revolutionaries. Well, the Qing Empire is really at a decline. Then there was the Boxer Rebellion a little bit later. These are this called the Society of Harmonious Fists, which sounds so cool. I would join it. Society of Harmonious Fists. I don't even know what they're about, but I would join it. But anyways, they used martial arts and self-strengthening, and eventually took on a very anti-Western, anti-imperialistic. And the turning point was when they started attacking Westerners, Western diplomats, Western missionaries, and started killing them. The government, which was pretty inept, sided with the Boxers, and this is when an international force, a coalition, comes into China, defeats the Chinese army, and basically now it's just a puppet state. So China has really been overrun. India, they tried the mutiny in the mid-1800s, 1858. That didn't work, and so now they're going to shift to political parties. And they formed the Indian National Congress in the 1880s. And this was a political party to kind of push the British out. And actually, some British were part of it, actually. And it was just like a peaceful political effort, Hindus and Muslims and the British working together to come up with a plan where Indians were able to rule India. The United States is an imperial power. They gained a lot of new territories in the 1800s. They gain foreign territory is Hawaii, and Alaska is purchased from Russia. Then they fight the Spanish-American War, which Franklin talked to us a little bit about. The start of that with the USS Maine. They defeat the Spanish and they acquire Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So some pretty substantial amount of territories. Okay. So I think this is the last slide. We see in the late 1800s in Africa and Asia a whole series of European countries and also minor players, the United States and Japan, conquering new territory. So Africa almost completely becomes colonized, and Asia also, with few exceptions like Japan, become colonized, controlled by these Western powers. Oh shoot! This is a combined lecture. I opened the wrong one. Oh no! And I'm already half an hour into this. Let's keep on going. Okay, one file. This is gonna be a massive file. Okay, so now I'm shifting gears. Okay, I'm shifting gears. So now we're gonna look in the Western Hemisphere. So I have this question: how did Europe interact with the rest of the world in the 19th century? And you could just say the Europeans just conquered all this territory. It's wrong. You are giving me a wrong answer. That's half the story. In the Western Hemisphere, okay, in the late 1800s, which I'm not going to get into the U.S. Revolution because that's before this course, but in other areas in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Americans from South America, Central America, North America cast off European imperialism. So it's kind of interesting. You know, one part of the world is being taken over by Europeans, and the other part of the world, they're fighting and resisting and becoming independent. Why? This is called colonial nationalism. Okay, what's the two principles of nationalism? Okay, what's the first principle? Connor, you remember? You I hope you said that your number one loyalty should be to your nation, okay? And that, what's the second principle? Let's go. Sinclair. That every nation should have their own state, their own government. So these people started saying, hey, we're not Spanish anymore, you know? What are we? Maybe we're Bolivian. I don't know. Maybe we're Brazilian, okay? And if we're Brazilian, that means we're not Portuguese. So we need our own state, Brazil, for Brazilians, okay? So this growth of nationalism, this resistance saying, hey, we're separate, we're different. In the United States, if we're American, we're not British anymore, okay? So the major changes were in the South and the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire was this massive empire. It goes all the way from Mexico to the tip of South America. It's complete Spanish control, unlike India, which was ruled by a corporation. This was ruled by the monarch, okay? But there was a lot of tension in the Spanish Empire. There was this very strict hierarchy based on your race, with the Spanish that was born in Spain, then the Spanish born in South America, then those with mixed blood, those that were mestizos or mulatto mixed with Indian or black blood. Then there was the native population, and then there's the African slave population. So there's this whole range, okay, of racial. But even if you're the same race, if you're Spanish born in Spain, it's different than Spanish born in America. So even this kind of international kind of tension back and forth. So there was a lot of upheaval, a lot of disgruntled individuals in the Spanish Empire right around 1800. So we're actually going a little bit back in time. So we're we're early 1800s now. So causes for the revolution in South and Central America is mercantilism. The colonies, don't worry about this. This is just the definition is the colonies are seen as sources of raw material and markets for the mother country, for the ruling state. And so this is a great disadvantage to the colonists. So they're just providing raw material. They're not going to get very rich. Politics. Who ruled? It was the Spanish from Spain ruled, not the local population. And definitely not the native population, and definitely not the slave population. Taxes were high, too high. That seems like everybody's main, grievance. And then also, there was some Spanish that were Creoles. They were living in the New World, born there. They went back to Europe. They read about the Enlightenment. Okay, they read books written by Enlightenment thinkers. They heard about the French Revolution. They heard about the American Revolution. And they said, now it's our turn. It's our turn. So the first rebellions were the Indian resistance. And this, I'll just summarize it very briefly, was not successful. So there was a revolt in Peru to reestablish like the Inca Empire, which was the empire before the Spanish came, and that was brutally suppressed. There's a Communal revolution in Central America that also was disgruntled about who could rule and with the level of taxes in that field pretty miserable. And then Haiti, again, this is slightly mislabeled. That's a slave revolt, not an Indian resistance. That one was the only one that where the bottom class, the lower class, the slave class revolted and was successful. They overthrew the French rulers. And so this is quite amazing. But for the most part, there were actually, this is just 3 out of hundreds of revolts where the native population, the slave population revolts, and they are crushed pretty brutally, okay? So what we see is independence comes as a result of the Creole rebellions, okay? So what happens? Napoleon, okay? Why might Napoleon play a role, okay? What does Napoleon do to Spain? How about that role? Well, I'd ask you if I was there, but this is kind of a little bit more complicated. All right, well, we talked a lot about Napoleon. He conquers Spain. He kicks the Spanish king, Ferdinand, off of his throne. What does that mean for the Spanish colonies? If they revolt, can Spain send reinforcements? No, they cannot send reinforcements. So if you look at that light blue color area from 1810 to 1820. So you have these three revolts, okay, in Spanish territories, okay. So, Argentina and Chile down there, okay. Oops. Colombia and Bolivia and to the north, and then Mexico over here. These are when the Spanish monarch is off their throne, okay? That big, huge, massive thing is Brazil, which is later, which we'll talk about, okay? It's also related to Napoleon. So a lot of this is all related. There's a lot of little ones in here, but a lot of these big ones is all because of Napoleon disrupting the European monarch, which allows the population to revolt. Creoles. It's not lower class rebellion. What it is Spanish people, Creoles, that were born in the New World that led the revolt. So if you look at Santa Anna in Mexico, he was in the initial stage. He was a secondary revolution, but he becomes a military dictator of Mexico, pretty much a Napoleon-like figure in Mexico, but he leads Mexico to become an independent country. They lose a couple wars with America, but that's all right. No major grudge there, I guess. At least the American side. The Northern Revolt, if you look up in those light blue colors, was led by Simon Bolivar, the George Washington of South America. Okay, and he revolts and wants to create a unified state, but eventually just splinters up into a series of smaller states. And then the Southern Revolt was under Jose de Saint Martin. Okay. And Chile and Argentina, and those countries are kind of freed from Spanish control. So we'll talk a little bit about the legacy in a second. Now Brazil, which was that big green country, the royal family fled from Portugal because Portugal was also involved in the Napoleonic Wars. So the monarch leaves, and the royal family stays in Portugal. They go back to Portugal after the Napoleonic Wars, but they leave one of their sons, and the son says, hey, guess what? We're independent. Is Pedro the First was his name, and he breaks away from his family and forms an independent country. He has there's only two people, Pedro the First and Pedro the Second, so it's pretty easy to remember. Pedro the Second has a very short rule. Pedro the Second has a very long rule. Basically, I don't know the exact date, but almost from 1822 to 1888. Most of that time period is ruled by Pedro the Second. He comes on as an infant almost and rules until old age. And he's a very noble ruler. The Brazilians love him. He ended slavery. He tried for a long time to end slavery, and he finally did. He made Brazil a strong, modern country as well, ruled. Eventually, I think ending slavery kind of annoyed some of the wealthy individuals. Eventually, there was a coup that overthrew him. But the vast majority of people loved him. Just a handful, and the amazing thing is he didn't fight back. He was so old at that particular time. He didn't really want to fight back, and I think he dies a couple years later. But so there's a coup. It turns into a republic. He steps down. He doesn't fight, and he's remembered as a kind of a great ruler. So Brazil is now independent as well. But the aftermath, unfortunately, with these Creole rulers and the coup of Pedro II, you end up with a lot of military dictators like Santa Anna. Economically, due to the slave population, they are freed. With independence, a lot of these countries end slavery. But did their situation turn better? No. So the native population, the slave population, their situation does not improve. The Spanish from Spain are replaced by Spanish from the Americas. So there's just a switch on top. And the Americans and the British have a lot of soft imperial rule. You have the Monroe Doctrine, which says America is kind of going to have a lot of influence in the Americas. But, if you look at the corporations down there and the wealth, a lot of it funnels back to American corporations. There is a lot of European immigration. There's a lot of Italians, a lot of Germans that move into South America, as well as North America. So all of these things are figures into it. But it's not as a pleasant or as a positive revolution as you would hope, okay, which would imply equality for all. All right, America. So this is America casting off, the United States casting off European power. This is a belief in manifest destiny that the United States should rule from coast to coast. Unfortunately, part of this nationalism is, we're American. Who's not American? Well, the natives are not American. So they're going to be picked up and moved in the early 1800s and put on reservations in the West. There's a huge population expanding, and they need more territory. So you purchase that pink stuff, the Louisiana Purchase from the French. The red is from Texas first declares independence and then later joins. And then the yellow, we fight a war with Mexico. And then they purchase from Mexico the bottom part, the Clanston Purchase. And then the Oregon Territory was declared American territory, and we almost went to war in the mid-1800s with Britain for more of it. But eventually it's kind of resolved. It's not American. It's American, not British. You can see America kind of expanding and casting off the French, well, the British, and not really European, but casting off the Mexican population for more and more territory, more and more independence. Now, one of the hiccups, major problems is in this whole idea of colonial nationalism is everybody American? Is everybody American? And clearly that was not resolved until after the Civil War, okay? And are we Americans first? A lot of people say, no, I'm Pennsylvanian first. I'm a Marylander first, okay? So there's some serious regional divides, and there's a divide in the North. What's the economy of the North like in the early 1800s? Okay, you should know this. All right, let's see. Cindy, in the back. What is the economy of the North, the northern part, New England? I feel like Dora. I don't know if you ever watched Dora the Explorer. They ask questions and then there's this pause. That's what my life is like. Industrial. Hopefully you said industrial. Okay. Mercedes. In the front, what is the southern economy like? You studied a lot of U.S. history, right? No. If you said agricultural, you're right. Pat yourself in the back. Okay. So the North is industrial. The South is agricultural. It's a plantation, slave-based. The North is family-based, very little slavery. So there's huge regional divide. So America is not really unified. It's also a lot of states' rights, state pride. And the sad part, too, is that the African immigrants as slaves are not considered Americans. They're not considered. They're considered a piece of property. They're not considered part of the American population. So there's lots of wars. Lots of escalation to the war. Only one more civil war. There's compromises between slave states and free states. Well, there's slow escalation to war. But the root is slavery. If there wasn't slavery, there wouldn't be civil war. But in the South, most whites don't own slaves, so they're not going to fight for slavery. They're going to fight for states' rights. And a lot of Northerners are racist, so they're not going to fight for slaves because they're not going to die for people they don't like. They're going to fight to preserve the Union. So it's really about slavery, but if you ask people fighting the Civil War, they'd say, yeah, I'm fighting for states' rights. I'm fighting to preserve the Union, et cetera, et cetera. So you see the gray states down here are going to be the slave states, and the blue states are going to be the free states. There's going to be this tension between North and South, and eventually a civil war. And so I can't go into the Civil War. If I taught U.S. history, it's 3 or 4 classes. But you see these, like the textured, each wave south is a year in the war, and so you can see that the North moved further and further south, and eventually they control the whole Mississippi River. They move south right across Georgia. That's Sherman's March to the Sea. They move south into Virginia, which was eventually what ends the war. They capture Richmond, the capital. Eventually they capture the main Confederate army in the North. All right, why did the North win? It was very long, brutal, much longer than anybody thought. The North wins. Why? I'm not going to go into all the battles. The North wins just because they had more people, more resources. This is a great graph right here. It shows the Confederacy and the North. So if you look at corn, it's twice as much corn production in the North. 4 times as much wheat production. Skip down to white men. This is like military age. They have 1, 2, 3, 4.5 times men of white men of military age. So just the reason why the North won was just they outlasted the South. Okay. So eventually, what I should have said here is America, after the Civil War, becomes America. It's not a bunch of separate states where people have loyalty to that. It's not separate, just the European population, the white population. No, it's also the black population. Okay, so the former slaves are now citizens. As a result, no. Still, huge biases, and the freed slaves can't vote. There's Jim Crow laws, late 1800s, all the way up to the 1960s, and so it's not resolved overnight. Okay. Now you also see if you go across the border, Canada, they throw off the British, but really not through war. It's just um, through progression of laws. So it's a British colony. It was a French colony. Then the British got it in the 7 Years' War, and eventually they get more and more freedom. Who is the head of state of Canada today? Anybody know who's the head of state? Who's on their money? I think they're on the money. Anybody? Elizabeth II is still the head of state of Canada. It's kind of funny, interesting. Anyways, so Act of Union, 1840. This unified some of the territories, and it gave them a right for elections, so they could elect certain members to the assembly. Okay, and then the British North American Act allowed them to elect all of their officials, their governors, their assemblies, both parts of the houses, that having their own constitution, and so at this point they become kind of independent. Though their head of state is still Elizabeth II, she appoints a governor general, I believe, who's kind of like a ceremonial figure that kind of oversees her functions because she doesn't going to be there. They kind of remain loyal to Britain in foreign affairs, so they fight in a lot of wars that Britain's involved, like World War I, World War II, even though they're not threatened, but they're independent, by any, measure. Okay? And Australia is also, in the 19th century, becomes more and more free. So Australia is discovered in 1770 by Captain Cook, and there's several 100,000 Aborigines, local population, but they're going to be overwhelmed almost immediately by immigrants from all different areas. Originally, it was a penal state. They dropped off prisoners in Australia. That's why I guess the Australians are a little wild, I guess. Descendants of prisoners, like, you want to escape? Fine. Run into the wilderness. So they didn't really have to build walls around their prisons, I suppose. And then Australia expands. You realize, wow, this is really conducive to sheep farming and sheep raising. Not can't farm sheep, but there's huge cattle are brought in. So there's a lot of ranchers that start moving in. Vast amount of territory for farming. You can grow wheat. You can grow all these other goods that people need, and so more people rush in for farming. And then there's a gold rush, so you had a lot of people rushing in for to strike it rich. Also, a lot of Chinese immigrants coming in too during the gold rush. So the population steadily, slowly increases, and Australia becomes a more and more important colony. But they too move towards independence. They become a dominion, which allows for some elections in 1850. And then eventually Australia is unified. That means all the different states in Australia become one country. And they have a constitution in 1901. And so with the constitution, they become an independent country. But yet they're also part of the British Commonwealth, like Canada is. So Australia kind of breaks free. So hopefully this isn't the last slides, because I want to do some conclusion. But I'll just say it now just in case it stops here. So we saw two things. We saw one in Asian Africa. This is a period of vast conquest and increasing imperialism, right? Okay, and so all these areas are taken over. But then we see in some of the what we call the white settler colonies, Australia, and New Zealand is also. South Africa and Canada. I didn't talk about the middle two. There's growing independence, and almost peacefully without war, they move towards independence. But I should say that some of the people, like the Aborigines or the Africans in South Africa, they didn't see it very positive. Okay, and then you see in from the U.S. all the way down, just a complete break, really, from the European rulers. So you see, the United States, we already revolted, but we expanded. We took territory from the French, bought it, kind of got British territory in Oregon, fought against the Spanish descendants in Mexico. Spanish breaking away from their country in Central and South America. So there's this great independence. So there's two sides to the story. Okay, let's see what